Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Joshi's Journey into 40K episode 5. I'm, of course, Joshua Joshi Howard, and thank you so much for watching. We are going to be going over the most recent event that we went to. There is Only War Grand Tournament held in Tempe, Arizona. So go ahead, make sure you get out your paints, any other hobby you got ready to go, and let's go ahead and start getting into the event. If you are just watching, if you're actually watching the video, thank you so much for doing that. I apologize. I am still very tired after we got back. It was a total of 13 hours, 6 hours there, about 7 hours back of driving. And I went there on a road trip with a couple of my friends, Lennon and Steve, who also participated in the event with me. But immediately after coming back, we had a long day. We got stuck behind a burning bus for about an hour, and eventually we found our way back here. But then we had a party immediately afterwards, and we had a bunch of people come on over. So still a little bit out of it as I'm recording this, but hopefully that shouldn't affect too much. If this is your first time coming in and joining one of our videos, just a quick overview of what we've actually been doing. During the off season as a League of Legends caster, I have about month and a half, 2 months where I don't have a whole lot of work actually going on. And so, oftentimes during the off season, a lot of us aren't exactly sure what we're supposed to be doing with ourselves the entire time. And so, my choice this time around was I saw 40K as an opportunity for something to really actually be potentially really good at, to really sink myself into over the course of about 6 or 7 weeks, and try and become as good as I can, with a goal of not ending in the top 100, but scratching my way into the top 100 on the global ITC ranking system. And overall, we've gone to an event every single weekend so far, and we have at least one more, but probably two more events still on the docket to try and actually scratch that goal. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about the event itself. There is Only War Grand Tournament is the first GT that I have signed up for, and the difference between this event and some of the previous events that we've actually gone to is most RTTs or Rogue Trader tournaments are 3-round events. They take place over the course of a single day, and they tend to be a little bit more local. They don't tend to have as much prestige in general, and most of the time, the quality of competition isn't necessarily quite as high in theory because of the fact that a lot of people are going to be bringing a couple more meme lists. I know a lot of the stronger players will tend to bring things that's like, this sounds like fun to play this weekend. It's not going to affect my end of season score on the ITC rankings because they only take your 6 best events. We can go ahead and just have some fun with all the other cool people that we know are going to be there. Whereas a grand tournament, like There's Only War, is a 2-day event over 5 rounds, where you play 3 rounds on day one, just like you would in an RTT, and on day two, you play 2 additional rounds. And the pairings at GTs are very strict relative to an RTT. I know a couple of RTTs I played in before. Your first 2 rounds are semi-random, right? You do the Swiss part, but you don't necessarily take into account all the full seeding, and so oftentimes it's a little bit messier there. But at a GT, every single time, once you have your pairings going through, it is just strict seeding after that in terms of who you're actually going to be playing against. And so every single time you get a win, your subsequent game will likely be against a tougher opponent. And so with that in mind, that is what we ended up going to. We knew going into this event, most GTs will let you know what missions you will be playing before you actually get there, as opposed to most RTTs where they will roll the mission on the spot and let you know what it is you're actually playing. And so for this one, we knew that we were going to be playing in order Conversion, The Scouring, Data Scry Salvage, Tides of Conviction, and Death and Zeal. And we'll talk about how exactly that changed the list and my thought process going into this event as we start talking about, as we start talking about the list. Speaking of, let's go ahead and get right on into today's list. Now, knowing that we were going to be going on a couple of different missions, which are a little bit more difficult for the Astra Militarum or the Imperial Guard, in Data Scry Salvage and Tides of Conviction, because they are both control 2 objectives, control 3 objectives, control more, in order to score your 4 points of each part of your primary scoring. We knew, or we expected, that we would need to bring just more bodies to the field in order to have a little bit more control over all of these large number of objectives. And the other thing that makes these relatively difficult is, especially on Tides of Conviction, because it is a long edge deployment and you only have 10 inches off the board edge, it tends to take your army and spread it out really far. And it makes it a lot more difficult for guard armies to actually screen some of our big hitters, in particular our tanks and some of our artillery that we might be bringing. So, with that in mind, it did change the way that we were actually bringing our list. And so, going into it, it has a lot of similarities to things that we have brought in the past, but you will see some noted differences, and I'll highlight them as we get there. To start with, for our HQ, we did take Lord Solar Leontus with the Warlord trait Grand Strategist for the 5+ CP refunds and just the extra CP that he does allow you to bring, and gives you a lot of buffs around the area. And in general, you will almost always see a lot of Guardless bringing Lord Solar Leontus just because of how strong he actually is. Beyond that, we actually took the Cadian Command Squad with the Finial of the Nimberdush first to ignore damage reductions and feel no pains, and also gave them the Warlord trait Master Tactician in order to give us 3 redeploys to play around when we actually get towards the first part of the battle, when we know who's going to be going first. Our last HQ slot, we did in fact take another tank commander, this time with Gatekeeper on top, the Relic Battle Cannon, a Lascannon on the hull, and 2 Heavy Bolter Sponsons. A no force organization slot, we ended up taking just a regular Commissar with a bolt pistol and chainsword in order to have another source of Perfectus orders and another officer, since as we will see later on, we don't in fact have as many officers in this build as we have seen in previous versions of the list. For our regular troops, we did take 6 units of regular Cadian shock troops, each with Melta Gun, Plasma Gun, Vox, and an autogun on the Sergeant. We ended up taking an extra unit of infantry here just because we knew, or we were expecting, that we were going to need more bodies just to hold the number of objectives that we would need to in order to actually score as many primary points as we could. In our elite slots, we stopped with the experiment that we went with at the last event, and this time we just took 2 units of Kazarkin. The first one has the Barbican's Key and Veteran Guerrillas to ignore cover at 18 inches or less, and the second one has heirloom weapons for the plus 4-inch range. Both units are otherwise equipped identically with 2 Meltaguns and 2 Plasma Guns and a Vox Caster. In general, the Barbican's Key one will just be kind of hanging out. I will deep strike them at some point after giving them Lord Solar's buffs. They will go blow up one of anything. And then in general, we've been holding the other Kazarkin unit kind of behind our L-shaped ruin or another piece of terrain in order to jump them forward, also next to Lord Solar, and put them from one side of the terrain onto the other, such that they can blow up anything that gets too close on the other side. In our fast attack, we did end up taking our compulsory slots here in order to get an extra sentinel in our list. And so what we end up doing, we are continuing with our unit of 3 sentinels with flamers and chainsaws. We've really been liking this into a lot of different armies, and just having this very large single unit of flamer sentinels really discourages a lot of light infantry in particular from trying to move forward up the board. And it is a really strong screen if we do need to deploy it a little bit more defensively. Beyond that, we took 2 units of 1 Scout Sentinel each, both equipped with a Plasma Cannon and a Chainsaw. The difference here and why we're not taking more of them or squatting them up is we really like the 1 individual Sentinel. One of the things that the block of 3 Sentinels can give us some trouble with is it's too tanky, actually, for some opposing units to actually use or to be able to use it as a launching point, right? If you get your melee units in and you try point my sentinel so that I can't fall it back, you just run in and you have so much control, and then after your turn, you jump in, you get into melee, and then on my turn, you actually cut it down such that on the second turn of my opponent, they get to then move and charge a new target. That can be really problematic, but 3 sentinels will oftentimes survive a lot of those charges. 1 sentinel usually won't. And so anybody who wants to try and charge a single scout sentinel in the middle, they're probably going to kill it if they're any good at melee. And then once my sentinel is dead, they will leave themselves out in the open where I will be able to just shoot whatever actually tried to charge it. Our last fast attack slot is a single armored sentinel. We brought this knowing that there were going to be a number of World Eaters and Black Templars and a couple other more aggressive charging style armies. And we just brought this as an extra unit to screen for relatively cheap for only 50 points. Dropped it in front. Ultimately, I was not super enthused with this 1 armored sentinel. It's definitely something where I probably could have used the points to upgrade all of my Lehman Russes to have multi-meltas on the sides and had 10 points still left over to try and figure out exactly what to do with it. But it was something where we saw so many charging armies on the other side of the board that we were thinking about bringing it just as a kind of a last ditch screen, someone to just hold next to my Lehman Russes or my mortars or Lord Solar in order to make sure that my really important units weren't getting charged. In our heavy support slots, we only took 2 units of 3 mortars. We saw that there were, I would say, about a quarter of the field was going to be playing light infantry units, so like Tau and Eldar and other guard, and other things where the mortars were really, really valuable against a bunch of units that will not necessarily have great opportunities to um, actually survive mortars, and I can pick off a lot of these light infantry. Ultimately, they weren't the most effective in most of our matchups over the course of this event, just because of the opponents we did actually draw, but it was kind of a hedged bet, right? Instead of taking 3 mortars, we only took 2, not expecting that we were going to need all 3, just because if you have that third unit of mortars into like a Space Marine army, they don't do a whole lot, right? Like, when you have mortars and these artillery units, you tend not to care a whole lot about how efficiently you're killing enemy points with them. You really just want to kill light infantry. You want to take people off opposing objectives, and just having that extra one would make a couple of matchups, and it would have made one matchup even better. But what we actually ended up seeing at the event, for me, was that they were, they were okay. I would always think about taking at least 2 mortars, maybe 3, to almost any event, but it was one where we decided this was one where we wanted to hedge our bet a little bit, bring the Armored Sentinel, and hope that it would be better than having the mortars. In practice, I probably would have rather had the third unit of mortars coming through instead of the Armored Sentinel, or have turned that Armored Sentinel into a couple of other things, but lessons learned, something we can bring to our next potential event. Our last heavy support slot, we took a squadron of 3 Lehman Russ battle tanks, and they were equipped differently than a lot of the other events that we have actually gone to in the past. We had all 3 Lehman Russes with Executioner plasma cannons on top. 2 of them had multi-melta sponsons, 1 of them had plasma cannon sponsons, and they all had Lascannons on the front. And the reason why we brought all these multi-meltas was because we chose not to bring the Rogel Dorn to this event, and we were missing out on some of that really big punch ability to take down some big vehicles relatively quickly. And knowing that there were a total of 8 Votium players coming to this event, we needed some tools with which we could actually still kill land fortresses relatively consistently, and that is how we chose to do it. We brought the multi-meltas, and it would also make us really good if we ended up coming into a guard mirror. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about the lay of the land for the event. It is, again, there is only War Grand Tournament hosted in Tempe, Arizona. At this event, there were 40 players who actually participated, and we had a lot of terrain being provided by Gamers Guild, the location that actually hosted it, and everything that wasn't there was provided by, I believe it was Smite Club, one of the local groups that they do have over in the Phoenix Tempe area, and they provided a lot of fantastic terrain as well. For the actual strength of the event, it was not quite as sharky as a lot of things I'm used to playing in Los Angeles and Orange County area, but one of the things to remember is that because LA has so many game stores, and we have San Diego close by, and San Francisco is not ridiculous to drive to, and Phoenix is not ridiculous to drive to, there's a lot of events. People here in LA and Orange County are kind of spoiled for events to actually try and go to. We can go to something every weekend, and I have. Like, I potentially didn't need to drive out to Phoenix if I didn't want to. I could have stayed in LA. And so a lot of players out in the Arizona area, if they want to try and improve their rating to like really high numbers, we'll have to travel a little bit more because they don't have events every single weekend, based on what I was hearing from some of the other players there. That said, there was still 1 player in the top 100, 4 players who were in the top 500, 3 players in the top 1,000. So not as many. So about 1/5 of the players there had what I would call a high ranking. But there were also 12 players who were not ranked in the current ITC season, though I would argue probably 3 of them would have had a much higher ranking, and 6 players were there at their second event in this ITC season. The thing to kind of look at, right? I've been looking at the ITC ranking as kind of like my first pass through is like this is how strong a lot of the players are. But the thing that I've kind of found is even more useful to kind of look at is what their points per event that they're actually getting to. And in general, if you have at least 100 points per event as your average over the 6 events for your ranking, then you're I look at that as a player that I need to respect, right? This is a player that is definitely going to be a player that is going to be good to potentially great, right? Some of the time, just based on kind of what they have, because the points are based on how many players are at the event and how many rounds are there. For people in LA, we tend to be, again, fairly spoiled, and even like middle of the pack performances will oftentimes get as close to 100 points on every event. But with all that said, at the end of the day, it was not as sharky as some of the events in even the RTTs that we've gone to here in LA Orange County, but it's also worth noting that I won't be playing with a lot of the relatively new players very quickly, provided I actually start winning my games because of the way that the pairings will actually work over the course of the event. Oh, and as we touched on before, they were also, I do a lot of scouting. I try and figure out, like, what kind of lists my opponents are likely to be bringing, what factions they're likely to be playing. There were 8 Votan players signed up for this event, right? We knew that's a lot of land fortresses. I think there was, like, 6 Emir players and 2 Greater Thurian players, coming to this. But there were also no guard. There was not a lot of Eldar. There's not a lot of Tau coming to this. It really was a lot of Votan, a lot of Marine equivalent armies coming to this event. And so it was something where I was a little bit worried about my potential performance going into this one, because I knew that Marines tend to be fairly good at the Control 2, Control 3, especially relative to a lot of other armies. But with that in mind, I went into this. I had a goal of winning 3 games and potentially dropping 2, with kind of a stretch goal of really hoping to go 4-1 at the event. And we'll actually talk about how we actually did as we get through the actual games. So before we actually start talking about all the actual games themselves, I do want to say I'm going to try and keep this one to no longer than about an hour and a half throughout the entire recording. And so there are a couple of games that we are going to be breezing through relatively quickly because they weren't necessarily super interesting. We had a couple of games that we really, really enjoyed, and we can really talk about those and go a little bit more in depth on those ones. But there were 5 games. I want to try and keep this around the same length as a lot of the other videos that we have done so far. So hopefully you'll forgive me if we shorten a couple of the games that didn't have as much play to them. So in game 1, we ended up going up against Eric and his Black Templars. And I have to say that Eric's Black Templars were gorgeous. They were super well painted. He did a lot of really cool things with his golds in particular. And I actually asked him after the game how he managed to get all of his golds to look so good. And he was saying, yeah, you take a warm color like a red or an orange and you give a wash to it to try and make it pop a little bit more. And that was something that was kind of cool. But we'll talk about a little bit more about that as we get towards the end, and let's talk about the list that Eric was actually bringing to the game. He brought Chaplain Grimaldus, Primaris Tech Marine, 3 Brutalist Dreadnoughts, 1 unit of 8 Desolation Marines, 2 units of 3 Eliminators, 3 Gladiator Lancers, the Space Marine laser tanks, a Captain in Phobos armor, a unit of 5 Intercessors, 1 Judicar, and 1 unit of 8 Vanguard Vets. And I will go ahead and say that I am not super used to playing against Black Templars, and it was not an army that I really kind of knew how to play against off the bat, but it was definitely an interesting list with all the Brutalist Dreadnoughts, a lot of worry. Like, it just kind of does a little bit of everything, but it's also missing, like, one of the big blobs that I know a lot of Black Templars like to bring with, I believe they're called Neophytes in Sword Brothers or something like that. And it was definitely missing that, so I was a little bit unsure of how this was actually going to be going. But Eric was saying that this was their first competitive event that they ever had gone to, and I told them, yeah, I'll try and be very clear with everything that I'm doing so that we don't have any issues over any ideas of like what's actually going on. And it sounded like it was likely to be a relatively fun game. That said, we were playing on conversion, and this is a mission that, in general, in my experience, I've had a lot of success on quarter deployment zones. And conversion is one of those, simply because if guard does end up going first, our Alpha Strike is so good, just because it is so hard to screen out both both of your sides that almost all the time I'm going to be able to get all three or sometimes four or five tanks shooting to do a ton of damage to especially vehicles and a lot of other large units. And so a lot of centerpiece units often disappear on the first or second turn on conversion in a lot of these quarter deployments. And so I was looking at this one as like, yeah, this might be a little bit tough because I don't know exactly how my opponent is going to be playing, but it is a good mission for me. If I go first, things will be great. So, to take a look at the secondaries I actually brought to this game, I did, in fact, take Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Raise the Banners High. Very standard stuff for guard. We really have we take two of them every single time, basically, Inflexible Command and Boots on the Ground, and then our choices for our third are Raise the Banners High, Retrieve Battlefield Data, and then, like, Bring It Down, or Assassination, or Abhor the Witch. And you know what two of ours are going to be almost every single time. It's just a matter of whether or not the third one is going to be a good flex on the game. Eric's secondaries in this one were Shock Tactics, Oaths of Moment, and Bring It Down. And I'm going to be honest, he did explain what they did to me, but as you guys will see in just a moment, I don't even know like how these scored ultimately. And before we get too far into this one, there was a couple of small things that ended up happening in this one. Namely, we had a couple of crates that we had to put in our terrain placement, and I put mine like basically in the middle of the board. It was basically a standard size crate, and importantly, Brutalist Dreadnoughts are too tall to actually hide behind them. So are Gladiator laser tanks, and realistically, there's a lot of infantry that are still in Eric's army in order to try and control some of these objectives, but if he wanted to actually use them, he needed to get his terrain in such ways where he could actually control a lot more of the battlefield with a lot of usage of obscuring terrain. And after I placed my crate down, Eric basically did the same thing with his crate, such that there is this massive central open firing lane with no dense cover, no obscuring, except towards the back. And because of that, this game was the shortest game I think I have ever played. And it was a game where Eric, as a relatively new player, ended up placing all of their Brutalist Dreadnoughts and a lot of their units kind of wide out in the open, not behind obscuring terrain. And guys, when you lose the first turn roll-off and you are completely exposed up against the Astra Militarum on turn 1, it's not going to be a good game. It's not going to be a fast one, or excuse me, it's not going to be a close one at all. I won the first turn roll-off, and on the first turn, I killed all 3 Brutalist Dreadnoughts. I killed both units of Eliminators by charging my Scout Sentinels forward. I killed a couple of the Chaplain's retinue coming through. I killed a Gladiator Lancer, and effectively, I killed something like 800 points of my opponent's army on turn 1. And then he resigned. Like, he didn't even choose to take his first turn. And the game was over. Like, it was 2 hours and 45 minutes per round once you actually received your pairing. And that was it. He actually resigned. And it was a little bit unfortunate in this game. Because a couple of things ended up happening. One, in the moment, I was a little bit annoyed at this, but now I think it's kind of funny. I offered to, like, well, if you're going to concede, thanks for the game, held up my hand. He almost refused to shake it, and then said, no, I should shake it. After all, this is all you have. I'm like, oh, okay. I, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know what to say about that one. It was a very fast game. And the other thing, so what I did is he said that, like, he has an army-wide feel no pain, and one of the first things I did is I marched my Kazakhin with heirloom weapons out from my terrain onto the other side of the terrain, and I used that to do a Kazakhin bomb. And I told him, this unit ignores all the feel no pains. You can't take feel no pains against this unit or my mortars or any of my infantry. But then when I started shooting with my tanks, I asked him, I was like, hey, don't you get a feel no pain with this? And he just shook his head. And so then the second time I shot a tank, I was like, hey, don't you get a feel no pain against this? and I wasn't sure because I just don't know the rules for Black Templars very well. And I wasn't sure if it's like only core or like only infantry or whatever. But it turns out that it's actually everything. And of course, my Leman Russes don't ignore Feel No Pains because they cannot benefit from the finial because they are not core units. But I mean, after he shook his head both times to like, no, no, Feel No Pains, I kind of stopped asking. I actually had the TO, who is a fantastic guy, by the way, Jason Flanzer. Big shout out to him. Um, Asked if I was like trying to ignore his feel no pains with my tanks, and I was like, no. I asked him a couple of times, like, hey, uh, you get a feel no pain here, right? And he would shake his head, and I mean that was probably it. I probably shouldn't have destroyed 800 points, but I'm still probably destroying like 600 points on turn one. But that's one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, I asked if you have a feel no pain, he told me no, shook his head, just picked his models up off the table, and you know, it was what it was. But I've never been quite sure like what to do in those situations when my opponent concedes relatively early on, and so I went over to TO afterwards and asked like, hey, uh, I just took my first turn, my opponent conceded, like, how do I score this? And so he was like, well, basically just assume that his units don't do anything else other than make saves for the rest of the game. I was like, okay, and then just kind of talk it out, like, kind of figure out what it would look like from there. And so basically what that means is if I can have like total control of the board the entire time, I'm gonna be maxing out raise the banners. I'm gonna be maxing out inflexible command. I'm gonna be maxing out boots on the ground. And so what ended up happening in this one was it ended up being 100 points, and I gave Eric a couple of turns of controlling their home objective, just because it would take me a long time to actually get over there and shoot anything off of the objective itself. But it ended up being a score of 100 to 22. And after that, I was like, okay, well, I now have nearly 2 hours left to just kind of wait and figure out what's going on. And so what I ended up doing for the rest of round one, for the most part, I ended up hanging out with my buddy Steve and his game because he was playing Imperial Knights versus World Leaders against Adam. And that will come back a little bit later as we start talking about further games. Between game one and game two, you actually have time to go to lunch and leave out your armies for any paint judging. You know, I left mine out, and I actually wasn't going to, but my buddy Lennon was like, no, your army's pretty well painted. Like, leave it out. I don't know what my painting score was, but I did so. We ended up going over to Chipotle, and I went with my buddy Lennon and Steve, and Adam, Steve's opponent, actually joined with us, partly because he realized, you know, one, he had a fantastic game, a super fun game up against my buddy Steve, and also we started talking about League of Legends. We went over to Chipotle, and he's like, hey, if I give you guys money, would you bring me back something? I was like, yeah, you just want to come with us, and, you know, we can go eat? And he was like, yeah. So we went and had a good time, went to get Chipotle, and also met up with a guy named Josiah, who is a Votan player, who was also at the event, and he seemed like a really stand-up dude as well. But that was relatively fast. Both Steve and I went and grabbed a something to drink as well, and then we started coming back for game two. For game two, I ended up playing up against Robert and his Inari. And Inari is a faction I've only played up against once before when I played it at the Game Ogre RTT, as I believe it was my first event in the sequence of all the events I played where I ended up winning the whole thing, going undefeated. But Robert's version of the Inari, he had one Farseer Skyrunner, the Incarn, 2 units of 5 Rangers each, 1 unit of 5 Banshees, 1 unit of 5 Striking Scorpions, 1 unit of 3 Warlock Skyrunners, 1 unit of 3 Striking Spears, 1 unit of 3 Shroud Runners, 1 Viper, 1 unit of 3 D-Cannons, and then you had a Harlequin Patrol detachment with a Troop Master, 2 units of 5 troops, a Death Jester, and 2 Star Weavers. We ended up playing this mission on the Scouring as the second event, or the second round of the event. And for secondaries, I went with Boots, Inflexible Command, and Raise the Banners High. And Robert chose to go with Behind Enemy Lines, Warp Ritual, and Scout the Enemy. And Scout the Enemy was an interesting one. It allows you to do an action with, I think it's any infantry, and it has to be outside of your own deployment zone, and you get 2 points, I believe, if you do it with in no man's land, and you get 4 points if you do it in your opponent's deployment zone. Rangers also do it such that it finishes on the end of their own turn, But if you do it with any other unit, so if you do it with like Striking Scorpions or Warlocks or anything, it completes at the beginning of your next command phase. So you end up having to, or your opponents have a turn in which to try and shoot you off and destroy the unit before it can actually finish the action. And so ended up being a little bit of an interesting one, right? With a couple of Ranger units, there were a couple opportunities for Robert to actually try and get that one. And of course, Warp Ritual is generally pretty darn easy for almost any Eldar army, or a lot of armies just get almost a guaranteed 12 points most of the time. However, on the Scouring is one where all 5 objectives do start in no man's land, and there are it's a control 1, control 2, control more, and you can do a scan on each objective for 3 points as well. With short edge deployment, this tends to be relatively good for guard. It is a little bit worrying for us because the objectives are relatively close together compared to a lot of other missions, and really strong melee armies, or again a lot of Marines, can have a lot of success on this in my experience, just because they can move from one objective to the other relatively quickly. And if you get first turn on this mission, you oftentimes get enough board control to just kind of keep your opponent off of their 2 objectives in their own side. But it's not the most difficult for Astra Militarum as long as we're deploying our terrain reasonably well. We can make sure we have units on both objectives to control, at least getting, like 32 points on primary if we can control the 2 that I believe do overlap your own deployment zone at least a little bit. This one was also a kind of interesting one for a while, but ended up playing out quite similarly to the one I played against, I believe his name is Justin, at the Game Ogre event. And ultimately, the game mostly came down to a single blunder made by Robert early on in the game, whereby he put the Incarn out in the open, and I was able to shoot it. And that basically ended the game. Because the Incarn ended up dying on turn 1, losing access to all of the auras that it has, losing access to all of the teleporting shenanigans that it has in order to move in on top of a lot of different places in your army and just rip things apart when it actually gets in. And the rest of the game was, Robert actually did a really good job using, I believe it's called Quicken, to get +2 to the charge, and really create a lot of issues around my northwestern objective in order to try and keep it. And there were actually a couple moments where Robert did prevent me from having more objectives than him, to deny me several opportunities for primary points. But what kind of happened for Robert was very similar to what happened in my previous game against Inari, where once the Incarn is dead, because it is such a big part of the damage coming out from an Inari army, we just kind of run out of things. And just as my first Inari opponent had said, I'm expecting that for 3 turns, I'm going to keep it fairly close. I'm going to make you sweat for a little while, and then on turn 4, I'm just not going to have enough units to do anything. You're going to consistently be peppering me with the mortars. Your tanks can come out and be relatively aggressive, especially once the D cannons are dead. And I think after the Incarn died, the most interesting thing I did this game was I actually took, again, the Heirloom Weapons Kazarkin, jumped them from behind cover into the open, and then I actually used them to charge into, I believe it was the Farseer and the D cannons, and actually just like kind of locked them down, prevented them from shooting out, and created a whole lot of problems on the middle objective. But after that was over, again, it was mostly just me kind of cleaning up. I brought in some infantry on different points of the map in order to score more boots on the ground, but because I never lost control of a lot of the banners, the big thing was on turn 5, I actually scored a whopping 10 points on banners because Robert had run out of things, right? He didn't have enough units to stop me, and by bringing in a lot of regular Cadian shock troops to the different sides of the board with nothing to oppose them, they were able to just get on top of all the objectives. And on turn 4, I had banners on every single one of the objectives on the entire board. And because he didn't have enough units left on turn 5, they all remained up on turn 5. So I got 5 points during my command phase, and I got an additional 5 points at the end of the game because all the banners were still up. And it's not common that I am actually able to get that close to maxing out, raise the banners on a map like this one. But ultimately, Robert seemed like a great guy. He's apparently traveling a lot for a bunch of different events, and even though the game kind of just ended up being a situation where Robert ran out of things, the game did end up being a score of 98 for the guard to 65 for Robert's Inari. And so ultimately, kind of a fun game, but I am really looking forward to a situation where my Inari opponent doesn't actually lose the Incarn on turn 1 or turn 2, so that we can actually see what kind of problems the Inari can pose for Astra Militarum in the future. For our third game and our final game of day 1, we end up playing up against Wyatt and his Votan. And we played this one on Data Scry Salvage, and this is definitely one of the hardest ones in my experience for the guard against a lot of different styles of armies, just because we are so squishy with all of our light infantry. We don't really have any like medium to heavy infantry. Our heaviest infantry that we tend to bring tends to be Kazarkin, which are still toughness 3 with a 4-up save. So almost anything that looks at them funny is going to remove them from the board. But let's go ahead and talk about Wyatt's list that he actually brought to this event. Now, Wyatt was playing Votan, and they were playing the Greater Thurian League. So they had the Brokir Forge Master, Einhir Champion, a Lord Grimnir, Uthar, 1 unit of 5 Hearthguard with the Volkite rifles, I think, and the grenade launchers, and of course the plasma swords. 3 units of 6 pioneers, all with Hylas and all the fixings with the scanners and searchlights. 2 units of 3 Thunderkin with graviton cannons, and 1 land fortress with the Magna Rail as well. As we already touched on, we were playing on Data Scry Salvage, which has 1 objective in both players' deployment zones and 4 spread out across the middle. And it is a control 2, control 3, control more in order to get your primary points, and you can get your tertiary primary points by doing an action on your home objective, and then you get 1 point up to a maximum of 3 for each objective in No Man's Land that you do control. For my secondaries, I went with the 2 standard ones, of course, in Boots on the Ground and Inflexible Command. And then the third one, I was really torn on this one because I know a couple of things about Votan. One, they tend to struggle to have enough units to screen out strategic reserves effectively. While a lot of their units do have a 12-inch denial bubble because of their ability to shoot reinforcements, they don't have a lot of units in general. And so my decision here was between retrieve battlefield data and raise the banners high. And in general, the goal of Astra Militarum on Data Scry Salvage, at least that to my understanding, is you want to take the board and cut it in half such that it is effectively a short edge deployment and really make the board really long. And if you can do that and start getting your banners going on 3 objectives, you should be in a relatively good spot. And so that's why I chose to take it, just because I was a little bit worried with how well players can actually string out the Pioneer bikes to prevent me from effectively scoring retrieve battlefield data. For Wyatt's secondaries, he went with Bring It Down. My army does max out at 14 points for Bring It Down, which is still pretty good. Like, if you kill all of my vehicles, you are getting 14 points, and if you only miss 1 Lehman Russ, you're still getting 12 on that one. They also went Lay Claim and War Patrol, which I thought was a bit of an interesting choice because our center of the board was relatively open. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But guys, this game up against Wyatt, I knew 2 things. One, if I win this game, I am more likely to go undefeated than I am to go 3-2. The other thing is that our 2 armies, I would say, in general, I have not had a ton of problems playing up against Votan players, simply because, as we said before, they don't have enough units to effectively screen out the Barbican's Key. The other thing that makes it fairly good is the Pioneers, with their pregame move, do still need to respect a 9-inch bubble around all of my units in order to actually move up the board effectively. And so oftentimes, they can't get a super strong Alpha Strike. But guys, let's go ahead and actually talk about this game a little bit more in depth. The first thing about this one is I started the game by putting a string of Scout Sentinels out across the board. But I make a crucial mistake when I am actually deploying these Scout Sentinels, in the fact that I did not measure between my central unit of the 3 Flamer Sentinels and my flanking one with the Plasma and Chainsaw. And I did not measure to make sure there was only 18 inches between the two units. And so what that meant was that if Wyatt gets to go first, he has a corridor by which he can move up his bikes, and they have this small corridor by which they can take their 12-inch move, pregame move, and then a 12-inch move again to move into my deployment zone. And it ended up being something that was hugely devastating for the way I was trying to actually play the game, because he took his unit of 6 bikes that he did start, or one of 2 units he had on the board, and Wyatt ended up getting first turn. And so, as he charged these bikes up the board, he went into that small corridor. He also moved into my deployment zone, and the worst thing happened here. He killed off 8 of my 10 Kazarkin with the Barbican's Key, after shooting them with a bunch of Hylas and shotguns and the Matter autocannons. And then my other unit of Kazarkin, which was hiding in a building, getting ready to jump out on the next turn to potentially do a lot of damage, lost 7 more Kazarkin in that unit as well. And so 2 of my big, like, aha, here's my cool bits of damage and my ability to create issues for Wyatt's backline were gone on turn 1. And even though, realistically, I think Wyatt only did maybe like 200 to 300 points worth of damage to my army, he killed so much of the things that I had to like play tricks with, right? There was not a whole lot of tricks left in my army to try and be aggressive across the board. But this game still had a lot of play left in it, because I ended up picking up that unit of bikes immediately after. And the fun thing was, because I deployed Lord Solar in my southwest quarter, he had to charge across no man's land in order to get a charge off into the Hernkin Pioneers on the other side. And I ended up charging in, I think it was 2 units of regular guardsmen, Lord Solar, and a Commissar in order to clean up these bikes and make sure they couldn't use well-ordered retreat to be an issue for the rest of my army. But Lord Solar charges from my southwest corner, from my home objective, towards the northwest corner to try and deal with that. However, the other big problem that I hadn't really considered at the time, when I was doing it, was normally up against Votan, they only have like the 1 unit of like deep striking or teleports that is really relevant on the first or second turn, and that is the Terminator equivalent. The Hearthguard can move into your backline, and oftentimes, if I don't get a big alpha strike off with my Barbican's Kazarkin, they are the ones that I am using to screen out my backline in order to try and make sure that there is nothing that these Terminators can actually do and get into my backline in order to do a ton of damage. And so what happens is, on his turn 2, Wyatt's Hearthguard teleport into my back line, and for the first time I think I've ever seen this going up against a Votan player, he jumps them in, and even though they don't do a ton of like points damage, they clean up both units of mortars on his second turn, and suddenly I don't have anything to like pick off those individual bikes or like pepper anything on his back objective to try and stop him from doing that. And they start looking for opportunities to get onto my backline objective as well. And so on my second turn, I actually have to take my Lord Solar, who had just charged into the northwest quarter. He had to charge into the southwest quarter again to try and deal with all of these Hearthguard that are coming in. Because Wyatt actually went first, I took my 3 redeploys, and I took 2 of my Lehman Russes off of the table. They come back in, and between all of these units, I am able to deal with that threat as well and kill all the Hearthguard on my turn too. But at this point, Wyatt's already done a decent job racking up points in the middle of the board, because they have so much board control that on Wyatt's second turn, they get 12 points on primary, and I get 0, because I'm not able to move all of my units out to actually control enough objectives. Because on my second turn, the Hearthguard actually get a charge off. They leave the closer unit of mortars alive so that he can charge them in, and mortars don't have OBSEC. The Cadian Command Squad, which is also setting the objective, doesn't have OBSEC, and my Commissar and Lord Solar are not in range of giving the order that would actually make them OBSEC. And so even though I'm controlling 1 objective over in the northwest quarter, I'm not controlling my home objective on my second turn, so that cost me 4 points, and that will be huge as we actually start looking towards the end of the game. So having recovered a lot of my space on turn 2, um, the other really big thing that happens on turn 2 is I bring in my 2 tanks that I had left off the board, and they are both the Executioner Plasma tanks with multi-meltas. And I come in and I gamble, and I even tell Wyatt, like, if this turn goes poorly, there's probably not a way for me to come back. But we'll see what we can actually do. And so what we do is we bring our 2 Lehman Russes from strategic reserves, and we point them at Wyatt's land fortress. And we know that these multi-meltas need to go off. Neither of them can be in a half range where they get the extra +2 damage, but they need to blow through all of the damage. They need to get through the Brokir Forge Master, turning one of the dice to a 0. And so that's why we actually make sure when we start shooting, we start with our plasma cannons on top in order to force Wyatt to make a decision to blank one of these 3 damage shots early on, or if they want to do the multi-meltas later on in case we get a high roll, right? If we roll a 6 or something, we force them to make the decision early on. And luckily, between the 2 Lehman Russes, we are, in fact, able to take down the land fortress. And so it does create some opportunities to at least continue playing the game. Wyatt's turn 3. And again, there's a lot of fun moments in this one. It's probably the most fun game I've had in any single game of 40k. He takes his Grimnir, which has mostly just been like handing out +1 toughness so far throughout the game, and he marches it into the middle of the board. But I think what had happened was that Wyatt had thought that War Patrol had a 9-inch radius that you need to be wholly within from the center, but it was a 6-inch. And so 6 inches from the center, between the 2 of us, we had put actually 0 terrain within 6 inches of the center. And so on his turn 3, the first thing he does is Grimnir walks into the middle of the board, does his first War Patrol, and it goes off. The second thing he does is he takes his unit of Pioneers that had started in strategic reserves, and they come in on turn 2. The second thing he does on his turn 3 is he brings in his Thunderkin, or 1 unit of Thunderkin and 1 unit of Bikes. And between the 2 of them, they come around the side, and with the rerolls from Uthar, with just the amount of damage you can do with the Graviton, they are actually able to take down both of the multi-melta Lehman Russes that we had just brought in, and they do a ton of damage to them. Just the drowning in auto wounding damage coming out from like the shotguns and the matter auto cannon, which ignores the toughness of the Lehman Russ. He's able to take down both of them without a whole lot of sweat over there. But at this point, I look at the board once again, and I'm starting to think, okay, we are in the bottom of 3. Wyatt's Grimnir is wide out in the open, and he's only gotten a 1 tick of War Patrol off. If I can kill that unit, that's 9 points that Wyatt cannot possibly get for the rest of the game. The other thing that I'm starting to think about at this point is I need to make sure that I can get as many boots on the ground points as possible. And so I know that I can never really get infantry into the southeast quadrant again. But because it's turn 3, I can now bring in things on the opponent's deployment zone. So, because Inflexible Command is such an easy objective to actually like max out on, I bring in one of my units of Cadian Shock Troopers towards his back quadrant. And their end goal is to try and move on to Wyatt's home objective and take that one from him and score me some boots on the ground points. Now, we don't do that on turn 4, or excuse me. Now, we don't swap the objective on turn 3, but we are starting to ask important questions of that. And the other thing is, we have our Gatekeeper tank and our full plasma tank. Between the 2 of them, they take a look at the Grimnir, and they are able to pick it up in a single turn of shooting. And so the Grimnir off the board. We do a little bit of extra damage to Bikes as well around the board. And I think we shoot some shots into the Champion as well, which is currently just sitting in the middle of the board. But ultimately, having taken down the Grimnir, we know that Wyatt's ability to max out some score on that is going to be somewhat limited. So on turn 4, and every single turn, there was something where both players end up doing something that could potentially swing the game. He takes his, bikes that come in from strategic reserve, and they jump on over to my deployment zone where I have my 2 final tanks who are currently trying to control as much of the center of the board as possible. And he uses them to do a lot of damage to my units that are currently on the northwestern objectives. And as he does that, more importantly, what he's able to do is he's able to get these uh, pioneers, and they charge in, and they get both tanks locked down in engagement range, meaning that they can't effectively move because guard does not have a way to fall back and shoot with our tanks that I know of. They are locked down in a spot where, yes, they can still control the center of the board, but there's not objectives in the center of the board that we're going to be able to control, and the tanks will not be able to move over to retake control of our northwestern objectives. And so that's why on turn 4, when it comes to my turn again, I only control 2 objectives. I control my home objective and only one of the northwest quadrant, because the bikes, or he has enough units that are able to move on towards the more central of the northwestern objectives, and again rip a banner off of that one as well. And ultimately, like, the number of banners that he's able to rip down by consistently asking questions of the northwestern quadrant ends up being one of the reasons why this game is so close. But my turn 4, I'm able to flip his home objective by charging some Cadians in, and they get into melee with, it's not one of the ECOGs, but like the Ironkin Assistant, I think it's called, because the actual Forge Master did die on his turn, or when I was able to charge in and shoot it. But on his turn 5, Wyatt is now thinking about lay claim. And he scores 8 points because he's still controlling 3 objectives across the center of the board, but he's not controlling more than me because I flipped his home objective. And what Wyatt does is, the way that lay claim works, right? You put the 3 objectives across the middle of no man's land, or I got to place them. He's able to string out his units of bikes such that one of them is on two of the objectives. One of them is on one objective and controlling the southeastern objective, and his champion is controlling one more of the objectives. And after doing all the tallying of all the other scores, we take a look at what it is that I need to do in order to actually win the game. And before Wyatt scores lay claim, he is sitting at 67 points, and I would be sitting at 73 points, assuming the rest of my turn goes like as planned. And there's not a lot that he can do to prevent the rest of my scoring from coming through. But what that means is, because each objective is worth 5 points, I need to get him off of 2 lay claim objectives, or take them with something of OPSEC of my own. One of them is in the middle of the board that is currently being controlled by 2 separate units of bikes, meaning that I would have to kill one unit entirely, and the other one I would have to kill 4 bikes in order to get it off of both objectives, or to get it off of one of the 2 objectives. One of them being controlled by the champion, I can contest it by running up some units, and I need to get my infantry to make an 8-inch charge, and then not die on the swing back with all the mortal wounds that the Exactor Hammer can do. So what we end up doing is we kind of skip everything else, and my unit of infantry goes in, they make their 8-inch charge. Then we take the unit, our two tanks are still kind of reeling from the engagement range that they were put under, and they shoot off and completely destroy one of the units of bikes. And of course, he has the CP to make them -1 to hit. After that, the Exactor Hammer champion swings back, does 9 wounds, and kills 9 guardsmen. And of course, I roll my morale. I roll a 1 on that, so I am able to flip one of the objectives. But because I didn't have enough firepower left over to try and flip the one other objective, or the one objective that was in the middle of the board, Wyatt ends up winning the game 77-73. And looking back at this game, like, it was, like, as I said before, probably the most fun on any game I have ever played. There are more times where banners were put up and torn down than in any game I'd played before. The fact that I was able to kill off the Grimnir in the middle of the board to deny 9 victory points with 1 round of shooting was amazing. The fact that he was constantly asking good questions of my control of the northwest objectives really helped him out, because if I'm able to keep up 2 banners on turns 2 and 3, I mean, that's an additional 2 points right there. If I'm able to sit on one more objective, if I had my Lord Solar in range to give my Cadian command squad and or my mortars objective secured on my home territory, the game's a draw, right? There are so many small things between our two armies that we did or didn't do that could have changed it. So, like, I look back at this one, like, it was not the cleanest game. It's the game 3 of day 1 when both players are fairly tired and the stamina really starts kicking in. And I know there's a lot of mistakes that both of us end up making, but because of that, because it's not the cleanest game either of us have played, it was probably the most fun game I think I have ever played. And to his credit, Wyatt ends up going on to go undefeated, going 5-0 at the event, and technically taking second because of the fact that his strength of schedule score was not quite as high as the guy who ended up taking first. After day 1 had finished, I'm pretty happy with how I played overall. I did win my 2 first games, and I ended up losing a very competitive and one of the most fun games I'd ever played on a mission that I knew was not one of my best. And Wyatt and I both agreed that it was one of the most fun games I think either of us had ever played. But we knew that we had to get ready for the next day. Lennon and Steve left our stuff very graciously by Gamers Guild to let us leave our armies in. They actually have, like, a room that's dedicated to doing painting classes in the back. And then we end up going off to round robin, have a good time, have a couple drinks, and then we just crash back at the hotel. And we get ready for the next day where we come into game 4. And this one, I know if I win this next game, I am more likely to go 4-1 than I am to go 3-2. And I go up against Killian's Chaos Knights. And Killian has 1 unit of 3 Brigands, 1 unit of 3 Executioners, 1 unit of 3 Huntsmen, 2 units of 1 Carnivore each, and 1 unit of 2 Stalkers. And we're playing this one on Tides of Conviction. And as I had touched on before, Tides of Conviction can be really difficult for the Imperial Guard just because it's a control 3, control 2, or excuse me, control 2, control 3, control more. That's just a lot of objectives for Imperial Guard to try and control. And because it is a long edge deployment and my army is super spread out, it's hard to get everything behind obscuring terrain effectively. And I kind of have to pick and choose where I want to take my battles really effectively before the game actually starts. And I'm going to be honest, guys, this was a game where I make a colossal blunder that ends up losing me the game relatively early. But let's go ahead and talk about the secondaries. I end up taking the 2 standard in Boots on the Ground and Flexible Command, and our third one was, of course, Bring It Down, looking at the number of vehicles that, of course, every knight's army does actually bring. Killian secondaries, they took Ruthless Tyranny, where you need to control a bunch of objectives and ideally get everything within dread range, which is typically 12 inches from your... Killian also took Bring It Down, and then they took Storm of Darkness, where you have to do an action on different objectives every single time, and it's a weird one. It like starts in your own morale phase and completes at the end of your next psychic phase, or the beginning of your next psychic phase. So like, it gives up your movement on your next turn with the unit. Guys, this one was again a little bit of a non-game, and this time it did not go in my favor. Now, I had only played against Chaos Knights once before, and that was in a 1,000-point game that I'm playing in an escalation league in at Paper Hero Games in Santa Monica. And my experience there had taught me that Chaos Knights is a mostly melee-focused army. And oh my god, was I wrong about that. I did not. I guess I knew, like, Killian did a good job of walking me through everything that was in his army in terms of, like, this has meltas, and this has autocannons, and this has claws, and this has swords. But for whatever reason, I guess it didn't process how effectively he would be able to kill all of my different units. And for whatever reason, even though he told me, like, his meltas were 30-inch range, there was a part of me in my mind that was like, oh yeah, 24-inch range. That's what my multi-meltas are. And we end up deploying all of our terrain and all of our units, and Killian does a pretty good job of keeping his stuff off on the back of the map. But I I remember looking at it and thinking, if I go first, I win, right? Like, I will kill 2, maybe 3 armigers on war dogs on turn 1, and I will take enough map control that I will never lose my home tier objective, so I should be scoring 8 points every single turn. But Killian ends up winning the roll-off. We actually roll 3 times. We both roll a 4, we both roll a 5, and then he rolls a 6, and I think I roll like a 2 or something, but it ends up being his first turn. And I was like, okay, well, the question is, can I afford, how many Lehman Russes can I afford to leave on the table, or will they die? Because they are realistically my primary way of actually killing his war dogs, because he brings just only war dogs to the table. And I thought that if I leave 2 of them on the board, he will consistently kill 1 of them, but won't be able to kill 2. And oh my god, you guys, I was wrong. I was so wrong. There is no way that I would have actually had both of those 2 tanks survive. And so I end up pulling only 1 of the tanks off the board. I leave 2 of them and the tank commander on the board, and he kills both of my non-tank commander tanks on turn 1. And that's way too much of my army. Like, way too much of my effective army to try and deal with his units. The other thing that Killian has is a couple of his war dogs had indirect fire on his missiles, and he used all of them to shoot at my Barbican Ski Kazarkin, which is good, right? Like, that's what you're supposed to do. But I didn't have a whole lot of counterplay left in my army. He had killed 2 of my tanks. One of my tanks is not coming in until turn 2 at the earliest. And effectively, I get tabled by the bottom of turn 3. And that's it, right? Killian ends up nearly maxing out his score. The only thing that prevents him from getting a perfect 100 is my army only gives up 14 points on Bring It Down. And he just does so much damage to me. He's able to get all of his war dogs, and he uses the boons in order to get the extra movement, and only ends up taking like 1 mortal wound each time. But ultimately, like, Killian just shot me off the board, and that's not experience I've only ever had in Control 2, Control 3 missions, where the first time it happened, I was playing up against Austin Ellingson and his Imperial Guard, where I remember talking about it last time. He had a really good matchup, and I didn't quite understand how to play Datascry Salvage as well as I do now. And also this time where I just fundamentally misunderstood what my opponent's army did. And so what ends up happening is I lose that one, 32-99, and I end up losing both of the maps that I knew I was going to have some trouble on going into this event. And then we go to lunch. We again go with Adam, and this time we go to Whataburger, because my friend Lennon keeps telling us, like, guys, Whataburger as a Texan, you gotta make sure you go to Whataburger, get your patty melts, you get your honey barbecue chicken sandwiches. We're like, all right, you've been talking about this all weekend. Let's go. We'll see if it is as good as you make it out to be. And I will say, his recommendation for the honey barbecue chicken sandwich or something like that was the best thing I've had at Whataburger. But don't say this too loud. I still think In-N-Out is better. But we'll go over there with Adam, and we start getting ready. I am 2-2. I believe both of my friends, Len and Steve, are 1-3 at this point. And they had both gone into the event saying, I think they're selling themselves short, but they said that they were just hoping to win a single game at the event. And so they've already kind of made their way through. And then we start looking at our last game of the day. The pairings come out, and I get Adam. I get the guy that we've gone to lunch with twice so far. And Adam was a great guy. He had a great attitude. He was bringing a very thematic list for the World Eaters, and we actually traded contact information. We're probably going to be playing League of Legends here at some point over the next couple of days. But the army that he brought for Adam was he brought Lord of Vakatis, 2 Demon Princes with wings, 1 unit of 9 Berserkers, 1 unit of 6 Berserkers, and 7 units of 5 Berserkers. He also brought 3 Chaos Spawn and 3 Rhinos to the table. And one of the things that's interesting about Berserkers in World Eaters is every time you shoot them and they lose someone but don't die, they get to move d6 inches towards the closest enemy unit, which means that if you don't kill Berserkers, they're going to get closer. And that means that, that is d6 inches fewer that they have to move up to actually get into your lines. And so, our last game of the day is being played on Death and Seal. And I'd already talked to Adam why coordinated deployment, in my opinion, tends to be so strong for the Guard is because it's so hard to protect from our Alpha Strike. And then we actually get there, and he's like, man, I'm glad you really told me exactly how it is you're going to try and play a lot of these different games. Or play if you go up against most armies on this mission. And so he tried to deploy in such a way that it was relatively safe. But for our secondaries, I, of course, go with Boots on the Ground, Inflexible Command, and this one because World Eaters, in my experience, don't tend to have great control over the sides of the board very well, just because they have to use a lot of extra units to try and control all of the different parts of the map. I chose to go with Retrieve Battlefield Data. For Adam's secondaries, they went with Blood for the Blood God, Pile the Skulls, and the Blood God's Due. I know that Pile the Skulls is you get 2 points up to a maximum of 5 per turn for every Blood type point that you discard. The other ones are Kill Things in Melee and Kill Things on and around objectives, and every time a unit, either yours or your opponent's, dies on an objective, then you will get a point per objective that something died on. As we actually get into the game, Adam takes his pre-game moves and moves up his units into the center staging ruin, and I win the roll-off for first turn. So on my turn, I take my unit of tanks, and after redeploying them so that I know I can get them in, I get 3 of my Leman Russes are able to shoot down into the units of Berserkers that are in the middle terrain. I take my Barbicanski Kazarkin and put them over on the other side of the board into the northeast quadrant, where they have access to shooting at the Demon Princes and Lord Invocatus and the Rhinos. I take a bunch of my Sentinels, and I just use them to kind of block up a lot of movement options for Adam. And ultimately, on turn 1, my Alpha Strike kills the unit of 9 Berserkers, the unit of 6 Berserkers, and 1 of the Demon Princes. We also take Lord Invo down to about half, and we almost kill a Rhino. And so, at this point, I'm thinking, when I move my tanks as far up the board as I did, I expected that they would probably get countercharged by Berserkers. But I had kind of tried to bubble wrap them with Sentinels and some guys in order to make sure that the Berserkers would only be able to get into one of the Leman Russes, and the other 2, one of them might get tagged, but the other one would for sure be able to get out without having to fall back, and one of them might have to fall back. On Adam's turn 1, he does pretty much exactly what I expect. He gets all of the Berserkers into the first tank, and they rip it to shreds. He also charges my Kazarkin with the Barbican's Key and charges them with a Rhino, basically ensuring that they wouldn't die, which I actually told him is like, hey, I actually want you to kill these so that I can start making sure that I can max out Inflexible Command, because as long as they are chilling over here, I'm not scoring my platoon infantry part of my Inflexible Command. And he's like, oh, good to know. Well, I'll let you have your one boots on the ground point every single turn, as long as you are losing 2 points for the inflexible command portion of that, of the victory points. But the other thing that was really funny this game, you guys, as Adam just kind of charges forward, this game kind of goes in 3 waves, right? There's the first time I shoot everything, his first wave of Berserkers comes through and locks things down. In order to make sure that I can pick up as many Berserkers on my second turn as possible, I have to use my Desperate Breakout for 2 CP on Sentinel. And that means that for every model they have in the unit that's trying to do this, on a result of 1, your unit is dead. Of course, it can't do that. Or, of course, I roll the die and it lives. But it's like, oh my gosh. So we move that. I take my Armored Sentinel, I take a couple other Sentinels, and the rest of my units are, in fact, able to fall back. And between Gatekeeper and my 1 Lehman Russ that can still shoot, we pick up another couple of squads of Berserkers. And we start bringing in Cadians in different spots to try and make sure we can max out retrieve battlefield data as well as boots on the ground. So as they fall back, we pick up another 2 or 3 squads of Berserkers. But then, and as we bubble wrap our tanks again, the one that didn't get to shoot on turn 2, on his turn 2, gets charged again and does end up dying this time. But he also, once again, gets enough Berserkers around a Sentinel to the point where I have to use Desperate Breakout again on my third turn. So that's cost me 4 CP in order to make sure that I can shoot at all of his Berserkers. And so I shoot at them again, and on my turn 3, as my Kaiser can hop over the wall, Lord Solar charges in. We are, in fact, able to kill enough of his units on turn 3 where he's effectively willing to call it. And after turn 3, he just says, yeah, I mean, my Demon Princes are both dead. Lord of Nakatis is dead. I have a couple of Chaos Spawn. This unit of Berserkers that we have here on the southeast objective, yeah, they're going to shoot off these 2, or they're going to shoot off 1 guardsman and they're going to go charge the other one to kill him and bloody this objective. But after that, I just don't have enough. I'm not going to be able to take any objectives again for the rest of the game because I've run out of things. And there's a part of me that wonders, you guys, as we start talking it out, I start saying, this is probably going to shoot at this. This is going to do this. This is going to do this. Something that I've realized, you guys, is that people are too generous, I think, when it comes to saying, you know, if X is going to shoot Y, it'll wipe this unit. And I don't think that's as true as people think it is. Yes, Gatekeeper, the tank commander, I'd say like 60% of the time, if I use like ingrained, or yeah, like 60% of the time, will wipe a squad of Berserkers. But that means that 40% of the time, that Berserker squad lives, you know? And that means that they hold on to an objective for an extra turn. And potentially deny enough objectives over the course of the game to actually potentially win, to get enough points on the primary. It ends up coming to a spot where, all that said, it probably doesn't matter because of the discrepancy that we have left on the board, where at the end of the game, as we submit everything, we submit a score of 95 for the Imperial Guard to 88 for the World Eaters. And because of the fact that Adam had already scored 43 points on primary, even controlling an extra objective for an extra turn that's normally worth 4 points only gets actually 2 points because you're capped out on 45 points per turn. The only question then is it possible for Adam to have scored an additional 5 points on secondaries? And I think the answer is probably no, but it is one of those spots where I do wonder if Adam could have scored a couple of extra points, and even if probably not won the game, at least brought it close enough to potentially force a draw. But either way, it ends up being a spot where we submit the scores. Adam's happy with it. I'm happy with it. It was a really fun game. The thing that was really funny is because I deployed all of my terrain basically as far back as I could to basically say, like, I don't really care about this terrain. Your army has no shooting, so I don't really care about cover all that much. There's one point because we're playing on a relatively tall table, and both he and I are about 5 foot. I'm 5'8". I think he was like a touch taller than I was. But the table was tall enough that we look at it and we're just like, this terrain literally doesn't matter. Neither of us are ever going to move into this. Are you down to just take this piece of terrain off the table so that we can reach into the center of the board? And we did. And it was just really good. Like, we started talking about it. We had a lot of fun rolling dice at each other. I would shoot him, and then he'd be like, "Oh, I'm gonna charge your guys," and it was a great time. So shout out to Adam for being an awesome opponent for both me and Steve. And we traded information. Like I said, we'll probably be playing League at some point here very soon. But with that, for anybody who is just now coming back into the video to come in for the summary, I did end up going 3-2 at this event. I won my first 2 games, lost my third and fourth games on missions I knew were going to be relatively problematic, but had I played even just a little bit better on both of them, I could have potentially won both of them, but of course I didn't. I know some of the big mistakes I made on games 3 and 4, but on game 5, I ended up winning a really close game up against somebody that we had been hanging out with all weekend, which was awesome. And so, with that in mind, I end up taking 13th overall at the event out of 40 players based on how the tiebreakers end up working out. And ultimately, that is about the goal, right, that I had set for myself. I had wanted to go to this event and go at least 3-2 and hopefully 4-1. And I think I was very close to potentially doing that. I think if I had deployed properly in game 4, I could have potentially won that one. If I had made 1 or 2 different decisions in different places in game 3, I could have won that one, but that guy ended up going 5-0 at the event, so I don't feel too bad. It was still an incredibly fun game. Both of us had a great time, and hopefully we'll have a chance to play against each other again at another point. Also, for both my buddies, Steve and Lynn, that came with me, they both went into the event with a goal of winning a single game out of 5. And I said that they're probably selling themselves short, but that's what they were sticking with. They both ended the game, they both ended the event going 2 wins and 3 losses apiece. And our total record of me and my friends going to this event was 7 wins and 8 losses, which was not bad considering what everybody's goal was going into this one. So let's start talking about the top 100 goal and a check-in on where that is before we start talking about what is next for potential future episodes. Like I said, my goal for top 100 is looking a little bit dicey at this point, but immediately after the event, I went back to the hotel and I took a look at what happened. And what I typically notice is that after GTs tend to get submitted to IGC rankings very, very quickly, whereas RTTs can sometimes take a couple of days. And after I checked that, the points that I got from this event, I did scratch at rank 192, meaning we did find ourselves in the top 200 for a very brief moment. But as at the time of this recording, we are currently sitting at rank 203. Also, as of this recording, we are currently sitting on 730.47 points. And the number 100 ranked player currently is at 860.8, meaning that over my next 2 events, I need to increase my total scores by about 60 points each, right? And considering that most of my 2 worst events are both already in the 90s, having gone about middle of the pack at the events that I did actually go to, effectively, I need to win 7 of my next 8 games, which is a cool goal to have, but almost an unattainable one, considering the events that we are actually going to. And we're planning to go to the Odyssey Games RTT that is this weekend. If you were watching previous episodes, you will remember that that was originally a grand tournament, but because it's Mother's Day and signups have been rather low, the TO did decide to downgrade it from a GT to an RTT so that people could spend Mother's Day with their moms. I would either need to go 2-1 or 3-0 at that one, and then at the Riverside Classic Grand Tournament hosted by XPZ in Riverside, California, I would need to either go 5-0 or 4-1 at that. And as we already talked about, it is a crazy Shark Tank at almost all the events here in LA and Orange County, and with all the XPZ guys going, with all of the Riverside Ripper Swarms guys going, right? There's a lot of good to great players that are going to be at that event. So, unfortunately, guys, it looks like the goal is very likely out of reach at this point, but we can still have a goal to get as good of a rank as we possibly can to try and get as many points as we can. And so, you know, with the 100 out of reach, my new goal is hopefully to try and find our way into the top 150, at least briefly, over the course of the next couple of events. As I've already said, the next two events we are planning to go to is, of course, the Odyssey Games RTT and the Riverside Classic that is going to be going on in the next couple of weeks. And then after that, you guys, I probably won't have time to play another event this ITC season. I probably won't have another event to go to before 10th edition actually drops. And so, with that in mind, I've had a ton of fun so far over the past couple of weeks. I feel as though, even if I'm not a top player, I still feel very comfortable in calling myself a good player over the course of the past couple of weeks. And so, hopefully, you guys have been enjoying following me along on my journey here into 40K. This has been a lot of fun overall. If you guys have any thoughts, if there's more things that you would like to hear out of each of these episodes, please let me know down in the comments below. If there are other things that you would love to hear about and future thoughts going into potentially what will happen during the regular League of Legends season, so, just make small bits of content as well, let me know for that as well. And please remember to like and subscribe. And of course, helps out with the algorithm quite a bit. But for now, this has been Joshi's Journey into 40K Episode 5. We went over There Is Only War GT. Hopefully, you've gotten all of your painting done and are ready for your next event as well. But for now, we will be taking off, and we will see you guys all next week.